Describe to me what you do for a living.
What do I do for a living? That's a very good question. I would say that I free people's minds. I recontextualize people's existence. So I take people from a framework of surviving into a framework of thriving.
You've taught me that stress is not caused by an outside circumstance, but by our story or what we perceive about the event. Mm-hmm. So how can we change our story in order to manage our stress and heal our bodies?
Stress is, I like the word resistance for stress too, because stress at times in life is very beneficial. Like if you want to get in shape, you need to have stress. If I go to one of my pro athletes and I give him 2 5-pound dumbbells and ask him to work out, he's going to look at me like I'm smoking the happy pipe, right? So you need stress to a certain degree in order to grow. But stress that most people have psychologically is all fictitious. It's made up about a potentially worst case scenario, a future event that hasn't happened yet. So stress like that we want to obviously try and avoid by realizing that it's occurring when we're resisting life. So there's something in life that we say we don't want or should be different or they shouldn't do that, then we're creating our own stress. We're not in harmony with life, we're not accepting life. So that's what will create a lack of ease, which is why I love the word dis-ease. Right? So the lack of ease is a precursor to dis-ease, which then obviously gets manifest in our physiology.
Yes, and so resistance is the opposite of ease.
So that kind of stress, like when we're talking about sickness or how do we generate health, we want to recognize that when we're in resistance to life, when we're basically creating friction between what is, like it's reality, it's our bank account, it's our spouse and what they said, it's our boss, it's our body today. When we create friction between that reality and our story or our perception of how it should be, then we create stress. And that stress, to me, is a precursor to all of the suffering that people have and then the myriad of different forms of escape that people, use, whether it be alcohol, nicotine, marijuana, whatever it might be. So that's all self-created. There's sort of a natural stress, and then there's the rest that we create through our imagination.
Right, and so like an example of resisting what is, that someone diagnoses them with cancer is not going to help them heal.
Right.
There's got to be a certain level of surrender, right? To get back into the flow. Like, how does that work?
If a doctor walks in and he says, by the way, sorry, I've got some bad news, your results came back, they're malignant, you have cancer. The diagnosis itself isn't the suffering. Now, that piece of information itself is just information. That doesn't actually change anything other than perception will now create fear. But that fear is fictitious, because the example I give is, let's say an oncologist comes in and he says something like that. And again, I'm not saying this is a trivial subject. This affects people every day. But if we can realize that the information itself isn't the suffering. The suffering is created by our response or our reaction to the information. Because let's say the same doctor came in 24 hours later after everybody's cried and there's drama and there's fear and it's like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And he comes out and says, oh my God, I'm so sorry. We got the wrong patient. You're actually fine. I mean, I don't want to make light of a very heavy subject, but you see that then immediately that person who was going through all of this suffering for 24 hours is actually now in a state of relief and joy. Equally, let's say the doctor is a fortune teller, and he says, your particular sickness is going to be resolved in a month. Then all of a sudden you may have the disease at this moment, but if you know that you're going to be fine, then again, the way that you respond to it is completely different than if you have a worst case scenario of I'm going to die, or whatever image you might be creating that's creating the suffering. It's still imagined, right? So that's where suffering's unnecessary.
So if someone comes to you with a diagnosis like cancer, MS, how do you coach them? What do you?
The first step for any kind of healing and freedom is acceptance. To immediately be okay with whatever's happening. So if somebody has a disease or a situation that they're fighting, then the first stage is always acceptance. Reality is reality. As much as the ego mind would like it to be different, that's where we suffer. So the first stage, if somebody comes or somebody has a sickness or they have a situation in their life that they don't like, acceptance is where suddenly now you become in harmony with life. Then, of course, you have choices as to what you want to do. Really in life it's very simple. You do something about it or you don't. But most people do neither, and they just resist it. So if someone did come to me, and they have, with a sickness, we first of all have to accept that that's just the current situation. Their resistance to it, their frustration about it, their anger about it, all of these emotions energetically are the precursors to it and contributing to its continuation. Right? So acceptance is relief, allowing it to be what it is. It doesn't mean we want it to stay, but it is what it is right now.
A lot of people are like fighting the fight against cancer. Is that not the right approach?
I mean, I find that comical, again, like in a compassionate way. But the world that we live in, the current paradigm, is all about fight or flight. And its main context is survival. So the whole idea of antidepressant, anti-war, antiperspirant, and the fight against cancer. Cancer is a byproduct of the fight already, right? Like, I mean, that's a broad stroke, but like the degree to which we have cancer or an autoimmune disorder where we're fighting ourselves, and now the logical, egoic mind wants to come in and say, let's fight that. Not realizing that quality of energy is what was the precursor to it. So again, we come back to surrender, not in a passive, weak way, but really in an acceptance and an allowing of life to be what it is right now. It's a completely different world that I'm talking about. It's not this world. The world that we live in, the paradigm we live in, is based on a surviving, fixing, judgment and blame kind of context. And as long as you're in that world, then you can only come up with solutions, quick fixes, or you're propagating the idea that there's something wrong, basically. And so, it's like the expression, if you argue for your limitations and they're yours, right? So it's like whenever I've helped anybody who believes they've got a problem, my job is to help them see they don't. They go and see an expert to help them with their problem. All they're doing is confirming their belief that they have one.
How do you explain to someone that, that baseball-sized tumor in your stomach or your colon is not a real problem?
It's not a problem, it's a tumor, right? And then I'm saying that, again, it's like, people think smoking's bad. It's not, it's smoking. I'm not saying there aren't consequences. I live in a world of physics, right? So in the world of physics, having a cigarette, depending on your constitution and your mindset, is going to have a certain degree of impact. For some people, they could, I've seen centurions who've lived to that age whilst they smoked, and then some people obviously die at a very young age. But it's not inherently bad, it's just what you're doing, and then it has consequences. So if somebody has a baseball-sized tumor inside of their body, I'm not saying that's a good thing and everybody should celebrate, but it's certainly not a bad thing, it's just what it is. So if we can start to deal with life in a very matter-of-fact sort of point of view in the world of physics, that's not to say there aren't things to be done. Like if ever I got diagnosed with cancer, I'm not saying that I would run around and be like, oh my God, I got great news. But I could have that reaction. I would still do something. I would still be responsible about whatever I have to do to clean it up. But I wouldn't see it as a problem. It is what it is.
So what are those things that maybe you would help this person do to clean it up?
My specialty is working with the mind and helping people see where they're stuck within these beliefs of inadequacy. That usually, for me, is the precursor to then suffering. Suffering then stimulates the chemical shitstorm that goes on in our body that then degenerates our tissues, et cetera, et cetera. So until you shift your mindset and find freedom, until you find true inner peace, then you can bombard any kind of disorder that you have, and chances are you may get rid of it for a sort of transitory period, but it's going to come back. It's like, it's like that show, The Biggest Loser. It's very powerful to watch these transformations of somebody's physique. They literally lose another human being, 400 pounds to 200 pounds. But, and I know this from inside stuff, the majority of them, I'm not saying all, will end up back there in 5 to 10 years because they haven't shifted their perception of themselves. So that would be the first place I go is, who do you think you are in your beliefs of inadequacy about yourself that create a mindset of fight or flight, a survival environment that you'll live in with a potential of threat at every turn that creates dis-ease in your body? If we don't address that, then the sort of in-to-out flow of life, it's still going to create at some point another disorder.
So would that be safe to say that fear is at the root of all disease, whether it's a collective fear, a personal fear?
Fear is without doubt the predominant mindset of this context of survival, right? Like it's so ingrained into humanity. It's not something that's wrong. It's a part of every human being where we live in a sort of a context, a paradigm of survival. And so fear is the byproduct of that. So fear will stimulate a part of our autonomic nervous system called the sympathetic nervous system, which releases adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, which affects, the blood pressure, releases extra sugar into the system, because you're under the perception that you're under threat. Now, centuries, thousands of years ago, that was maybe appropriate because there was literally a potentially life-threatening situation with a wild animal, let's say. But now it's your spouse, or it's your boss, or it's rent that's due in a week. And yet the system reacts in the same way as though it's a life-threatening situation, so you're still releasing cortisol, you're still releasing adrenaline, noradrenaline into the system. So the tissues are still going to respond to the hormones and the chemistry. So until such time that you recognize that life is just what it is, and I'm creating the imbalance in myself that then is creating dis-ease in my system and consequently in my physiology. Like that whole cascade of events is really what I'm undoing for people so that they can find freedom.
You touched on something really great. Your immune system isn't as strong when you're in fight or flight. So one of the biggest things when you get a cancer diagnosis or something, and you automatically go to fear like so many people do, addressing the mind and your thoughts about it are so important because you want to get out of that stress response to heal, right?
So again, like as soon as you get a diagnosis, you get a piece of bad news. The subject matter is honestly irrelevant, right? It could be a diagnosis of cancer. It could be that you're going to lose your job. It could be because your spouse is leaving you or someone passes away. Like whatever the event in life, it triggers that sympathetic response, right, which is the stress response, releases a cascade of hormones into your system, which does suppress the immune system. Also, on the flip side, the parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest and digest and rejuvenate relative to fight or flight or freeze. When you're in sympathetic nervous system, you don't digest properly. It's not a priority. It's not like, I'm being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, let me digest my burrito. It's really not important. So when you've got a sickness, to understand, and certainly from a point of view of Ayurveda, we recognize digestion as the key to health. So if you're not digesting your food properly so that you can metabolize it properly, so that you can generate new tissues such that you can be healthy, if that system is interrupted because you're too busy trying to survive, then you're not generating new tissues. So does that make sense? So you're actually accelerating, which is often the case, right? If someone gets a really bad diagnosis, often they will see that without maybe treatment, that it becomes, the problem becomes exacerbated. Conversely, and what I like to do to help people understand the power of the mind is if I said to somebody, okay, yes, this is maybe the diagnosis, however, you're going to be fine in 2 months, like I guaranteed, the relief they feel is the release of that sympathetic response, the stress response. There's a feeling of complete liberation and joy, which then is equally the precursor to rejuvenating your body.
Because the relief and joy release chemicals and hormones that are actually healing and rejuvenating and restoring, right?
Absolutely, yeah. The parasympathetic nervous system, as I said, is going to allow the body to be in a state of ease, such that you can focus on the things that would rejuvenate the body, which are all about like rest and digest, and rejuvenating the system. So it's literally like, in a funny way, it's like we all have the capacity to be bipolar. And these are survival systems that have been, fine-tuned over centuries, right? This is hardcore, like hardwired, into our DNA. So everybody's got that capacity, but as long as you're leaning more towards sympathetic, which is how most people today live their lives, unfortunately, there's so much stress from society. Everybody's sort of overwhelmed with whether it be social media, to opportunities, to obviously taking care of kids, to keeping up with the Joneses. It's almost like we've become inundated with choice at some level, that it's overwhelming, it creates a lot of stress, and it inspires a sympathetic response, which then becomes a vicious cycle, because now people are exhausted, their adrenals are screwed, they're not sleeping properly, then they're drinking more, they're smoking, they're taking medication.
You often tell me that the universe has our back, right?
Yeah.
How do we trust in that when, we think we're dying? Or how do we really trust that we're going to be okay?
It's a big leap. I'll never use the word easy with the work that I do with people. It's just incredibly powerful. It's incredibly profound. But it is a big leap to go from this mindset of surviving to a mindset of thriving. In the mindset of surviving, there's this sort of underlying belief that I'm not taken care of. And that's because of the nature of the ego. The ego is a separate entity. So if I'm separate and I've got the whole world to compete against, or the whole world to try and be accepted by, I hope my butt and my boobs and my outfit are good enough for me to be part of the gang and be loved and accepted. It's a big leap to go from that to a paradigm of complete integration and unity where I can thrive. But it's completely possible because that's where I live from and that's what I teach people. And that's the arena of trust. That's where I'm part of life, I'm not separate to life. And if I'm held by life, I'm a part of life. That doesn't mean that shit doesn't go wrong in your life, but there's an acceptance of it. And in fact, there's almost a gratitude for it, because I know from personal experience the amount of adversity I've been through, even though at the time it might not be pleasant, has invariably been the precursor to me becoming a better human being. So even the darker parts of my life, in hindsight, are all something that contributed to who I am today, for which I'm grateful.
So you would take a diagnosis like that as kind of evolving to my highest potential, right?
So yeah, if there was a diagnosis that I got personally, again, I wouldn't say that I wouldn't do something about it, but I would look at the opportunity that life is presenting me to become a bigger human being. I use an expression for myself, which is can I be with this? Whatever the situation, can I be with this situation? And I'd like to think I can. That's freedom. Most people, they cannot be with this situation. And that's where they resist life. So they can't even be with somebody saying, hey, you're an idiot. Or the wife or the husband or the boyfriend or the father saying something about, well, what happened to your career? Or why haven't you done? This creates stress. But if you can be with all situations in life, then you're free. And that, to me, is the ultimate experience of being human. That does not mean that you don't do things. I'm still super proactive if something were to occur in my life, but I'm okay with it.
What is Ayurveda?
What is Ayurveda? Ayurveda, in terms of its actual translation from Sanskrit, is the wisdom or knowledge of life. I've always, even from when I was young, been fascinated with health and wellness, being the best you can be. It was always part of even going through high school and college. And then I came across Ayurveda probably about 16 to 17 years ago. And I was sitting there and I was like, finally, someone knows what the hell they're talking about. Because Ayurveda is, like I said, it's the science of life. So to me, it's Mother Nature. It's based on the principles of physics. Everybody knows that fire is hot. And the air is mobile, it moves like the wind, and it's light. And water has got a certain, obviously, moisture to it and dampness. These things are inherent. So Ayurveda, based on these principles of Mother Nature, it uses elements to talk about someone's constitution. If they've got too much fire in their system because they drink alcohol, they like spicy food, maybe they've got a lot of stress at work, they're going to have too much heat in their system, which would explain why they have a little acid reflux, or their skin is breaking out, or whatever's creating too much inflammation in their system. Conversely, somebody who's got too much air in their system, they already have a predisposition to being an air constitution, and then they're always traveling maybe they're a flight attendant on a plane, or they travel a lot, or they like crackers and salads and things that are drying and light, and then they wonder why their skin is dry, or they're constipated, or they're not sleeping well. Because they're contributing to that element which doesn't have much grounding to it. So we use Ayurveda, or at least I use Ayurveda, because it just makes sense. It works. And
what does that look like if someone is trying to heal? It has to do with eating, it has to do with...
Yeah, again, we have an expression in Ayurveda. Ayurveda has a lot of what we call shlokas, or just kind of quotes, short quotes. And one of them is with healthy digestion, medicine's not necessary. With bad digestion, medicine doesn't work. So basically it comes down to good digestion, which goes back to what I was saying earlier, to what degree can you actually process life. That's another form of digestion mentally. If something happens to you and you can't process it or digest it, then you have residue. And the same is in our body. If we don't digest food properly, we have something that we call armor. It's undigested food, and it's kind of like a sticky glue as a texture. And that blocks all of the different channels in the system. It gets stuck in the small intestines or in the colon, or it gets into the deeper parts of the body. So that becomes the precursor to disease again. I think one of my favorite parts of Ayurveda is that we have something called samprapti, which is a Sanskrit name which describes the process of how disease comes into existence. And there's 6 stages. And when I first heard this, it was just so beautiful and so simple. And the first stage is accumulation. You accumulate too much of what we call a dosha. Dosha is the quality of energy. You've got too much fire, you've got too much air, you've got too much earth and water in your system. So let's take fire. If you accumulate too much fire in your system, you may have a symptom of like a sour belch from time to time. No big deal, but that would be a sign of there's too much heat in the system. The next stage is aggravation. Now it becomes aggravating to the system, so that what was a sour belch now becomes a little bit of heartburn. Again, in this day and age, no problem. We got the solution, right? You take Prilosec, Nexium, whatever. You don't actually deal with why do I have the imbalance, because it's considered somewhat normal to have heartburn. But that's the aggravation. The next stage is spread. So now the excess heat that's in the system that hasn't been addressed because that individual is still eating too much spicy food, still drinking alcohol, putting too much heat into the system, spreads. And they notice that they've got this little skin rash or irritation. Maybe they're getting like really sort of upset stomach because it's spreading now around the system. The 4th stage is localization. So now that excess heat that's in the system that started with accumulation now finds a weak spot in the system where we've lost some integrity. Let's say the guy we're talking about was a football player in high school and maybe took one too many blows to the knee and his knee's a little funky. It's okay, but that would be an ideal place for the excess heat to find a home because there's a loss of integrity in the joint. So now that progresses over time to maybe arthritis. There's this inflammation that becomes localized in a weak part of the system that started way back when there was too much accumulation in the system. And then the final stage, the 6th stage, is so it becomes manifested as disease, and then the 6th stage is it becomes diversified. So now it actually alters the tissue system itself. Maybe it becomes rheumatoid arthritis. So the beauty of that system is if you understand those 6 stages, that if you want to prevent disease, what do you prevent? Excess accumulation. Prevent buildup. Now to me, where the biggest buildup is right here. You build up trauma, you build up experience, you build up doubt. That becomes an aggravant. Why can't I do this? Why can't I get the job? Why can't I find the love of my life? Why can't I get in shape? And so you see that whole disease process applies to the physiology and the psychology. So what I'm bringing people is really the ability to let go. When you let go of whatever's accumulated in the system, and we see it in the material world, right? You walk into anyone's closet, there's usually a lot of accumulation. To let go creates space, and space then is the precursor to healing.
So rather than take a Prilosec to suppress the aggravation or another surgery to try to tweak the localization, it's getting to the root, which is usually an accumulation starting in the mind?
So the accumulation can occur, it occurs everywhere, like I said, so like psychologically, physiologically, emotionally, materially. You know, you go into most people's garages, there's an accumulation. They've got the $50,000 car outside and they got a bunch of shit inside, right? So that accumulation becomes at some point an aggravation. It's a weight that you're carrying. It blocks space. When you block space, you block possibility. It becomes a stagnation. When people are walking around like depression, anger, these things that people have, guilt, well, they're all based in holding on to something. That's the accumulation. It's accumulation of trauma. It's accumulation of judgment. It's accumulation of shit in the system. So wherever it is, whether it be like psychologically, emotionally, physiologically, or materially, accumulation, everybody can relate to it as a human being, right? Like there are businesses that deal with getting rid of your stuff, and it's very cathartic. So by recognizing the process by which disease or dis-ease, the lack of ease, comes about in your life because you accumulate too much, then at least now you have an access to freedom. So a lot of people are walking around carrying all of this stuff that creates their depression, that creates their guilt, that creates their anger, the weight that they're carrying. And what they're actually looking for is relief. They want peace. Like, to me, ultimately, what human beings really want is true inner peace. They want to be at ease. Like, people talk about happiness. What is happiness? Happiness, to me, is the absence of the search for happiness. That's true happiness. When you're no longer looking for happiness because you're completely content where you are. To go back to the example I used of having too much heat in the system that could then lead to heartburn, that the individual is doing the best they can. Most people don't even know what Ayurveda is. So there's no judgment of the person going to see a doctor, and there's no judgment of the doctor treating it with Prilosec or an antacid because that's what he knows. However, it creates more symptoms. It creates more problem because the root cause hasn't been addressed. I mean, you even watch these commercials. It's like crazy. Hey, don't worry. You got acid I mean, I'm not going to name names, but we all know the guy that does it. Like, you got acid reflux. Don't worry. Take this purple pill and you can still eat your pepperoni pizza. Like, no judgment. Do it all day. But then don't get upset when you get rheumatoid arthritis later in life, or you're starting to get inflammatory disorders, right? There's zero judgment in my world. People can do whatever they want. I don't make anyone wrong. But if you want to understand how to create health, how to create vitality, how to love life, how to be free, then so far I've seen that these systems work quite effectively.
What do you see as the flaws of Western medicine or conventional medicine protocol of drugs and surgery?
So, when it comes to Western medicine, it's a big topic out there, and I don't like to bring judgment, but it's a big business. And to me, I think people need to understand it is a business, meaning that if the system of Western medicine was really dedicated to people's health, then pharmaceutical companies would be celebrating when drug sales drop. Now, I'm not in the building, but I don't think that's what they're doing. So if Ayurveda is the science of life, then I would say Western medicine is the science of disease. And it's incredibly important for certain acute, like life-threatening situations. Like if I'm riding my Vespa and I, God forbid, get hit and I break bones or I've got internal bleeding, I'm not going to go to my herb cabinet and put turmeric paste on my broken femur, right? So it does have a place. But I think people need to understand that it's managing symptoms more than actually looking at the root cause of why somebody has an imbalance. And again, I love looking at things like really objectively. If you just look at the path of a doctor in terms of what they go through, they become experts in disease. Like they study like all of the disorders in the world, infections to any kind of, from cognitive disorders to physiological disorders. So they're actually experts in sickness. So if you just think about that for a second, that would be like, I'm a professional ice skater and I want to become really good, and I'm going to go and find the guy who's an expert in falling over, right? So, or for me as a golfer, I love the idea of like, if I want to be a good golf player, I'm going to go and find the expert who knows how to shank the ball off the shaft, and right? It just doesn't make sense. So you've got to know what you're dealing with. With Ayurveda, it's the science of life and health. So I'd like to consider myself an expert in health and wellness and loving life and being happy. That's my specialty. So I'd much rather go and see someone who's, if I'm sick, I want to go and find out how do I be healthy as opposed to how do I manage sickness. And the Western medicine system, again, makes a lot of money because it's keeping people alive whilst managing symptoms. And I had an amazing GP when I first got here who was a great guy, and he really was trying to become more contemporary and incorporate some of these alternative methodologies. And I asked him, I said, so as a doctor, what would you say is your primary intention? And his words verbatim was to keep people alive. Now, that's got a lot of merit. But to me, I'm not interested in just staying alive. I want to be alive. I want to feel amazing. It's sort of from a scale of -10 to 0 to +10. You know, most people live from 0 to -10. It's like they're managing symptoms all the time. They're taking a lot of tablets. They're in a constant state of slight unrest. You know, this isn't my life, but I'm getting there. Versus, well, what if you lived from 0 to +10 and life was amazing and you were at ease and you were happy and had inner peace? But that's why when it comes to Western medicine, I really don't want to bring any judgment, because I really believe that human beings fundamentally, like, really want to make a difference. And when somebody takes a career path to become a doctor, I would like to really believe that that human being is doing it because they want to make a difference. So this is no slight on doctors, and, you know, God forbid, I may need one or many in my lifetime, for which reason it really is paramount, and it's incredible for emergencies and really saving people's lives. I think what we're talking about is really how can we take somebody who's maybe not in a life-threatening situation, for which Western medicine and doctors are incredible and lifesavers, literally. But what if we're sort of living in that first standard deviation of human beings and we just want to thrive? Then I think it's much more important to recognize the importance of mindset, diet, and lifestyle. That can transform your existence as a human being.
Right now, it's unethical for people to give false hope and be positive. But it's ethical to plant a seed of fear and say, oh, you only have 3 to 6 weeks. Well, they're not, you know, like you said, fortune tellers.
Right.
That may be the average that they're perpetuating.
Yes.
But there's so many instances of healing and recovery. It's like, let's not focus on the worst case scenario.
But again, because all of these things are being generated, like, within this, as I said, this old paradigm, this old world of surviving, where there's a problem and here's a solution. But we're not really getting out of the system, the mindset of, I'm a separate entity living in a big world and I'm trying to survive. I'm trying to get somewhere. And that is the precursor to the sickness, the disharmony between religions, between nations, between couples, between family members. I mean, it's the same thing. The world is fundamentally sick in that place. You know, it's like people say, well, we want world peace. You can't create world peace when you've got 8 billion people who, the majority of them, are at war with themselves. Do you see, the systems just it doesn't fit. It's all well-intended, like people want to be well, meanwhile they're beating the shit out of themselves internally with the way that they feel about themselves. You can't be healthy whilst at the same time you're hating yourself.
Our system is sick as a whole. We're in a paradigm of survival. What does the paradigm of thriving look like, and freedom and unity, like you said?
So the paradigm of thriving, which is what I'm committed to bringing in this lifetime, it's to recognize I'm not a separate entity. I have, and call that ego. All human beings have that. Like, by design, I can't look through other people's minds. They can't look through mine. So just the design of the equipment gives the impression that I'm over here and everything's out there. And then I have to do whatever I have to do to survive. I have to look a certain way, apparently. I have to wear certain things. I have to drive the right car. All of these things, because fundamentally as human beings, we want to be loved and accepted. However, that component of us, by design, is not loved and accepted. That's its belief structure, which is why it's perpetual. You can't fulfill on something when that's its actual structure. So, spirituality, to me, or whichever word you want to use, consciousness, is our true nature. And that's where there is just nothing but love and harmony. And not in this kind of Pollyanna, like, kumbaya way, but like literally, when you tap into your true nature, which to me is the access to healing, is to realize our true nature, that I am not separate from anybody else, that I am part of the gang. I don't need an American Express black card to fit in. I'm part of humanity. That then creates the relief. That is the letting go of my independent fear that if I don't do X, Y, and Z, that I'm not going to survive.
How do we let go?
Well, so the process of letting go, how do we let go? First of all, like I would start with the easy things. You walk into your garage and you see how much shit you have that you don't need. It's a win-win. You create space and you give it to someone who could benefit from it. You give it to somebody who could need or use the stuff that you just got boxed for like the last decade. Then maybe attack your closet and realize how much stuff you have that you don't need. There's a letting go there. And then really forgiveness, when it comes to emotions, is the greatest access to letting go. Because it's a much deeper conversation and could be a whole documentary by itself. But people are under the impression that other people hurt them, that they did something wrong to them, or they did something bad to them. And really, they just did what they did. Your interpretation of wrongness or judgment is creating your suffering. You know, we've got all sorts of archetypes out there in the world, right? That, like, let's take a Jesus Christ, for example. Here's somebody who really embodied these principles. That people can be putting a nail through his feet and his hands, and yet he's still coming from love and acceptance. There's no judgment. There's no wrong-making. There's just compassion. So letting go, I'm not saying this is easy, but it's by realizing every human being is doing the best they can within the limits of their awareness. And then you drop the judgment. That doesn't mean that you don't have personal preferences and you do what's right for you and to lead a life that you enjoy. I'm not saying you should hang out with somebody who's abusive, not at all. But understand that their behavior is a byproduct of everything they've been through from childhood to wherever they are today. And it just breeds a world of compassion as opposed to judgment. First of all, the ego is inflamed. It's too late, right? That's like somebody who's had 6 beers and you're asking them, be sober. It's like it's already in your system. What I would like to do is get somebody to the point where they don't react in the first place. Because you learn to listen. The ego is only going to get triggered when you perceive something as threatening. Right? If somebody does something or says something that threatens your perception of how things should be, you will react. Like, think about road rage. It's completely nonsensical, yet it happens to the point of death at times. Like, here's a car made of plastic and metal pulling in front of your car, driven by someone you don't know, and you've got all sorts of FUs and shit flying around. You're saying that person controls your emotions. It makes no sense. I don't even know who that is. Why would I get upset? That's more a reflection of what they haven't let go, the frustration, the fight they had with the wife, the stress they feel financially because they're in a job they don't like, but they're staying there because they've got to pay the rent in a house that they're not happy in. I mean, there's a myriad of things that are compiled within somebody that causes that reaction. It's got nothing to do with that person. It added 3 seconds to your day. Oh my God. And I get it. I'm not being flippant. I get that person feels stressed. But if you want to be healed, you've got to look at the source of your frustration. You've got to get to the root cause of your dis-ease if you're going to find freedom. People are looking to solutions without looking at why do I have the problem in the first place. So it just perpetuates the problem. It seems logical, and people do it all day, and there's experts, as I said, who will try and help you with the best intentions. They're not bad people. But it doesn't actually address why is there the imbalance in the first place. So when the ego reacts to something, I guarantee you it's because the ego is feeling threatened. Fight or flight. And that's not wrong either, but it leaves you feeling powerless and ultimately sick. Which goes back to what I said about that question of, can I be with this situation? Like when you're really powerful, not in terms of like manipulating, but you're powerful in yourself, then you realize I can be with whatever situation is happening. That does not mean I'm not proactive, that I don't take action, but it doesn't upset my inner terrain of peace. Most people are completely the other way around. They are trying to be forceful. They are trying to manipulate circumstances. When this person behaves this way, I'll be fine. When my bank account looks like that, I'll be happy.
So at the level of the mind, subconscious belief that a lot of people have that leads to disease is a feeling of inadequacy.
Yes.
what are some tools or what are some ways that people can reprogram that belief about themselves?
The predominant mindset that exists out there for every human being is some belief of inadequacy. Like, not enough-itis, right? Like, whatever it is. I'm not good enough, I'm not skinny enough, I'm not pretty enough, I'm not rich enough. That is a human epidemic. And it ain't going anywhere. And that's okay. So awareness of that part of us is the freedom from it. The quote that I use is that freedom isn't of the person, it's from the person. So that's a little bit of a mind twister, right? Like, so when somebody comes to see me, I'm not interested in freeing them. I'm freeing them from the idea of who they think they are. That's where the problems lie. Another quote I use is, no such thing as a person with a problem. The person and the problem are one and the same thing. Like, I don't have one problem. And that's not like, hey, that guy's really cocky. Like, that, I have situations to deal with. It's not a problem. That would create resistance. There's plenty of things that I have to deal with that may be not ideal, and I do something about it, or I don't, but it's not a problem. You go out there in the world, everybody's got a shitload of problems. No, they don't. They have circumstances that they're resisting, or their mind, their ego is saying, that shouldn't be that way. They shouldn't talk to me like that. That car shouldn't pull in front of me in traffic. And that's where the suffering lies. So by shifting that mindset and realizing that you're fighting your own beliefs of inadequacy about yourself, you're fighting your own judgment about life and how you think it should be, the world according to I, that's all that's creating your suffering. I'm not saying that circumstances are easy for people. There's a lot of people out there I really admire because they deal with difficult circumstances. But I have people I know who have all the money in the world and they don't have difficult circumstances, but they still suffer because they live in a belief set of inadequacy, or that life is somehow wrong and it should be different. For the most part, the way when people are looking through the lens of the ego and in fight or flight and surviving life, then they're under the impression they have to control circumstances. It becomes a forceful mindset as opposed to a powerful mindset. With force, you're trying to control everything. You expect people, you want people to be a certain way, to behave in a certain fashion. You want your bank account to look a certain way. You want your husband or your wife to behave in a certain way. When all of that is how I want it, then I'm fine. And until then, it's like this position psychologically. Versus allowing life to be, granting people the freedom to be who they are. That's love. That's what love is. Love doesn't have an agenda. Love allows people and life to be what it is. That's fundamentally what the energy I'm talking about is love. Love is all embracing. Now, that doesn't mean you live with someone who abuses you. You can love them for who they are, but you have personal preference too. You include yourself in the love. But that's where there's no reaction. Life is what it is. I fully love and accept circumstances as they are. And I'm not saying that's easy to do, but it is possible, and it's a very powerful place to live from.
What if you're trying to change the situation with the best intentions? For instance, if your wife is sick, but she's not seeing certain things, and you just want her to heal, how do you remain at ease and support her while allowing her to make bad choices?
If I'm with somebody who I love and adore and vice versa, then I'm going to recognize when somebody truly has an intention to help me versus protect my ego's view of what's right and wrong and don't interrupt. Now, that's how most people live their lives, right? Fundamentally, most people are living from ego to ego. When everything seems to be in harmony and you agree with my opinion and I agree with yours, well, then there's love and love-making in the house. It's great. But when you don't agree with my opinion and I don't agree with you, then, make sure there's no loose utensils hanging around because they're going to be flying. So to me, again, it comes down to love. It's fully embracing somebody exactly as they are. This is the foundation for a really genuine, intimate relationship, is really accept someone fully for who they are. So if I was really with somebody who was sick and they truly didn't want to do something to change, then I would honor that. But I also don't think for 1 minute I would be with somebody who is like that, because that's somebody who's stubborn and resistant, and that's not what I'm going to attract into my life. So that's why I said it goes back to the fundamental problem would be with the relationship, not the sickness. The lack of relating and love is one of the precursors to the sickness, you see.
Like a mother caring for someone who's sick, or a husband caring for someone who's sick. What is the best space that they can hold? Just kind of advice for the closest person to someone who's dealing with the disease. Like, how can they support them in the most powerful way?
If somebody out there is like dealing with somebody who's sick and they genuinely love that person, then obviously you're going to do everything you can in your means to help that person heal. Because maybe someone's sickness is actually causing a little bit of, whether it be dementia, or would look at something like Alzheimer's, where somebody doesn't really, they're not fully functioning. So then you almost do have to step in and you become the guardian for their wellness. It's like, it's probably the stock answer in Ayurveda when somebody asks a very like broad question. The answer is always, it depends. Like, how old are they? You know, how strong is their system? How severe is the disease? How disciplined are they? How committed are they to well? There's so many components that goes into somebody actually creating healing. There has to be a degree of volunteering that I want to be well.
Awesome. So give me your one takeaway message on healing.
To encapsulate everything that I was talking about, that I hope really people get, which is just to like really accept, more than life, accept you. Like, honor life. Like, there's not a human being on the planet who doesn't see a brand new born baby and doesn't intuitively feel the preciousness of that. And everybody out there is no different. But at some point, you decided that you weren't that precious anymore. And that's when abuse started. So it gives me chills a little bit. But like, if I could get people to realize how precious they are, they're an expression of life. There's no other you out there. That's 1 in 8 billion. That's pretty special. But I guarantee you, most people don't give themselves that kind of love and care. That would be a wonderful precursor to healing. So I guess, you know, the other part of that, of really discovering or really unveiling health, because to me health is inherent. We get in the way of it, right? So it goes back to what I was saying about the accumulation being the first step to disease. So let go. Like, the hatred you have of a parent, the judgment you have of a coworker, the wrong-making you have towards your spouse. Like, just let go of that inner judgment, blame, and basically a victim mindset. Like that, if you can let go of that and recognize that life is actually working for you, not against you, then again, you're going to generate healing and freedom and inner peace. Again, if you're into that kind of stuff.